Hey, good to see you again. While we're still in the week of the spring feast, I thought this was a good time to talk to you about something out of Colossians chapter 2. I'll just keep you for a few minutes. I was thinking about, as a Gentile believer, a New Testament believer in Jesus Christ, how are we to properly relate to the feasts that God ordained for the Israelites in the Old Testament? There's definitely types and shadows there for us, but how do we connect with them in a way that will bring value to our lives without distracting us from Christ? That's what I want to talk about today. So these feasts were actually a type of Christ as our rest and as our enjoyment. I don't know if you realize that these were called festivals. They were celebrations, and they were a time that God desired to bring his people together and convene them in one place to enjoy him and connect with him, and also to enjoy one another. And they were also a time of Sabbath rest, a time of resting in him and ceasing their labor. And they were reminders of all that God had done and provided for his redeemed people. So, Christ came not only to fulfill these feasts, because really they're all a picture of him, but he is the real feast. He's the reality of the feast. We've been talking about this. Grace and reality came through Jesus Christ. So Christ is the real feast. So if we miss seeing Christ, then we've kind of missed seeing the whole point, right? So in whatever way you are led to acknowledge and celebrate these feasts, maybe it's a traditional way or a non-traditional way, the thing we need to be aware of is that we not be defrauded of Christ, is how Paul says it. And we become carried away from the central focus on Christ. For Paul went on and said in Colossians that the prize is the enjoyment of Christ, the experience of Christ. In whatever feast or expression that we are finding to celebrate, we want to find Christ in that. And that was a real goal I had this year in celebrating Passover, that I wouldn't miss him in anything that I chose to do to try to acknowledge Passover or first fruits. I wanted to find him in it. So let's look at Colossians 2:16 and 17. Paul says here, "Let no one therefore judge you in eating and in drinking, or in respect of a feast, or of a new moon, or of a Sabbath, which are a shadow of the things to come. But the body is of Christ." So we're talking about shadows in all of these things: eating, drinking, feasts, and even the new moon. That may not be a term you use, but it's something that we're actually celebrating here on this channel, and that I'm trying to teach more about each month. At the beginning of the month, a new moon means new month. It's the Hebraic beginning of a new month, and there's always a turning at that point, and a refocusing and a fresh start. And it's tempting to kind of get off into reading the new month like a horoscope, where it's like, what's in store for me this month? And it becomes about us and becomes about a lot of things other than Christ. So that's a goal I have for these teachings, is that whenever we enter into a new month, we're finding Christ in that new month. And the same is true for the annual feasts, these spring feasts that we've just come through: Passover, first fruits, Feast of Unleavened Bread. We want to find Christ in that, because those things are shadows. But the body, if you think about it, if you're standing out in the sun and you're there and the sun is hitting you, and then your shadow is on the ground behind you, you want people to focus on you, not talk to your shadow on the ground. That would be insulting. It would be, it wouldn't be proper. And so we want to find Christ and look at Christ. The light of the sun is shining on him, and the illumination is shining on him. And what's being cast off from him are these types and shadows in the Old Testament. That's what Paul's talking about here. The body is of Christ. So according to Colossians 2:17, these rituals, or these ordinances of the Old Testament, are shadows of the real spiritual things that are in Christ. There's many elements. Just as the Passover alone, there are so many different elements, and each one of them is casting off a different shadow that shows us something about Christ, and they're all designed to point to him. And Paul warns that if we get off and focus on these shadows, we're going to be defrauded from Christ and carried away from him. There's a real concern he has, And he's trying to point us back to Christ is the real food, Christ is the real drink, Christ is the real feast, Christ is the real Sabbath, Christ is the real new moon. So as you approach each of these things and desire to learn from them and experience them, find Christ in them. And it's interesting, in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul calls Christ our Passover. Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed, he says. And then he goes on and says, then let us keep the feast. And there he's actually talking about the Feast of Unleavened Bread because it's connected to Passover. I want to ask you the question, is Paul now, has he switched and is he now aligning with the Judaizers that he was so fiercely resisting and that he opposed everywhere else in all of his letters? Is he encouraging us now as Gentiles to follow him into Judaism when he says, let us keep the feast? I think the answer is definitely, emphatically no. From all of Paul's writings and the body of his work, we know that that is not what he's doing here. So when he says, let us keep the feast, he's talking about something deeper and more real than just keeping an outward expression of a feast on a certain day and time and in a certain prescribed way. So let's dig deeper into these things and find out what is the body, not what are these shadows. So Paul sees Christ as the fulfillment and the reality of the type of the Passover and the type of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and really all of the other feasts as well. And Paul knows that our temptation here will always be to focus on doing some kind of spiritual activity and then camping around that revelation. You know, like the Gentile believers that were influenced by the Judaizers. They were pushing the sign or the type of circumcision. And you see this over and over again in the New Testament. Paul was like, we need to get past just the outward sign on your physical flesh of circumcision. There's more here than that. There's a circumcision of the heart. And so he was constantly leading them to go deeper into their connection and experience of Jesus Christ circumcising their hearts. And it wasn't so much about how they outwardly expressed circumcision. But the Judaizers kept focusing on the outward deed. And this is something that we need to understand, that the enemy is going to come in and he doesn't care whether we're involved in some kind of good or religious activity or if we're off into some bad or sinful activity. He just wants us to be distracted. He wants to defraud us from Christ. And if Satan can get our focus, our central vision off of Christ, then he knows that he's achieved his purpose. This is what we have to be aware of. So let's let all of these shadows point us back to him. And let's not get our eyes off of the prize, which is experiencing and knowing Christ and being satisfied by him as our real feast. Well, it's been good talking to you today. I'll see you in a day or two with another video on the Feast of Unleavened Bread as a type of Christ and our connection with Christ. See you soon.